Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, executive editor of TNSR. This week's Horns may be a first in that it deals with a work of fiction. The subject is the new novel Damascus Station by David McCloskey. McCloskey is a former CIA analyst who drew on his experience analyzing the civil war in Syria and being stationed throughout the Middle East in writing the novel. One of his goals, as he says, was to ensure that the novel, quote, got the CIA right. In order to see how well he did, the book talk is followed by a conversation with Steve Slick of the Center for Intelligence Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. This is a fascinating talk in which McCloskey details both how he entered the world of intelligence and how this world influenced his perspective on the novel. It's especially of interest to anyone who's considered entering the intelligence field themselves or may have experience there. This talk was given at the University of Texas, Austin. Let's listen in.
So our guest today, visiting all the way from Dallas, is David McCloskey, the author of Damascus Station. David's a former CIA analyst and also a consultant with McKinsey & Company. David's unusually spare biography, that we hope to flesh out a bit more today, notes that while he was at CIA, he wrote regularly for the President's Daily Brief, worked in field stations across the Middle East, and also briefed senior White House officials, ambassadors, and Arab royalty. So I've asked David to open with a short introduction or overview of his book, after which I'll join him in a conversation about his career, the novel, and Middle East politics. And at the end, at the close, we'll save time for your questions. So David, welcome to the University of Texas.
Thank you, Steve, for that kind and sparse introduction of my bio. I'll try to fill some of that in. And thanks for having me here. It's still, as a alumnus of both McKinsey and the CIA, I'm sort of accustomed to a lifetime in secret and highly secretive organizations. Being out, actually speaking about a book that I wrote that's got my name on it, that's in the wild, is still pretty cool and pretty fun. So thank you for hosting me here. For those who haven't read it, I thought I'd just describe a little bit about what the book is about, and then tell you a little bit more about me and how I came to write it. So Damascus Station, it is a work of fiction. It's a novel. It's a spy novel. It is set in the early years of the Syrian civil war. It follows a CIA case officer named Sam and his Syrian recruit Miriam, who break one of the cardinal rules of espionage and fall into a forbidden relationship. They go into Damascus to hunt down the killer of another CIA officer, and in that process really come kind of face to face with their tension and the conflict and the passion in their own relationship, as well as into conflict with a brutal pair of Syrian brothers who are in the military and security services and who are guarding a very dark secret at the heart of the Syrian regime. So it's obviously a spy novel, so it's about espionage, but it's also about love. And I hope it's also about what it means to be human in the middle of a very inhuman conflict. As is probably apparent from my bio and just described in the book, none of that would have been possible without my past life at the CIA. So I actually came to the CIA through, I think it's not too well known. I was an undergrad. I was 19 when I took my first polygraph, actually, for the agency. And there's an internship program that brings folks in when they're in their undergrad years, and you do 2 summers, and then, if it's a good fit, you can join full time. The head of what was then known as NISA, which was the Near East and South Asian Analytic Office, was an alum of my pretty small school outside of Chicago, and he came through Chicagoland on a recruiting trip. And I was 19. I wanted to understand the world, travel the world, learn how it worked, and most of my professional experience up to that point had been as a cashier at Wendy's in high school. And so the CIA calling felt like a bit of a step up. So I was really interested in the role, and I think applied, kind of thinking, well, there's no way this is actually going to work, so I'll see what happens. But was fortunate enough to get the offer to make it through the clearance process. The first summer I was there, I worked on the 34-day war between Israel and Hezbollah. The second summer was the run-up to what became the Israeli strike on Syria's nuclear reactor out of the Eastern Desert at Al-Tabar. And so I was really, just after those experiences, pretty hooked. I joined full-time after I graduated. I worked primarily on Syrian political and security topics, although I did a rotation in the Counterterrorism Center focused on targeting the foreign fighter networks that were shipping folks through Syria into Iraq to target coalition forces and Iraqi civilians. But most of the work I did was focused on Syria. And as a result, I ended up having a really front row seat for the uprising in early 2011. I was working on the account. And that, Steve and I, I'm sure we'll talk about it a lot more in conversation, but that experience working in those early years that really saw the kind of optimism of this protest movement turn into a pretty bloody civil war was a very professionally and personally impactful time for me. And just to paint some of the kind of shattering that has happened to Syrian society. I mean, it was a country of 23 million people prior to the war. About half of that population now is either displaced internally or has actually fled the country. The poverty rate, depending on the statistics you look at, is somewhere between 80 and 90%. It's effectively split between 4 different kind of zones of influence or control. And over 500,000 Syrians have died in the war. And that's based on the UN number that I think is about 5 or 6 years old because the UN stopped counting the casualty numbers. Not to mention the hundreds of thousands more who sort of disappeared into, regime detention centers and things like that. So, as a analyst watching this and having spent time in Syria and in the region, it was a really pretty emotional and kind of heartbreaking experience to have lived through this and watched it. And so when I left the agency in 2014, and I had some time in between leaving CIA and joining McKinsey, the consulting firm that I was with for a number of years. And I spent about 3 months just kind of writing about that experience, character sketches, memories that I had of Damascus, of Syrians, of other CIA officers. And I think really just kind of processing some of what I lived through and seen through writing. I put it aside when I joined McKinsey because I don't know how many of you are aware of what management consulting is, but you end up working about 75 hours a week, and it's pretty hard to write a novel when you're doing that. And so I kind of put the manuscript aside and came back to it about 5 years later for a number of reasons, was able to take some time to actually write. And I think having that space in between the first go at writing and then coming back to it, I was able to look at the manuscript again, and I kind of realized it's like what I'd worked on before was like really bad from a commercial writing standpoint. No one would have wanted to buy it or probably read it. But I still wanted to write, and I really loved the process of just writing. And so I sat down and started to get a little bit more structured about it and thought, how do I put something together that I would want on my nightstand and that someone else would actually want to read? I think having the space between my time working on Syria and my time at the agency and that was also helpful. I had a little bit more maybe objectivity about it, and I thought, I really want to do 2 things with this other than just kind of have people enjoy the story and the characters and drive through the narrative. But there were 2 themes I wanted to bring out in the book. One of them was I wanted to get the CIA right insofar as I could. And obviously it's a novel, right? So I do take there are breaches of tradecraft in there that I've added to make things more dramatic. But I wanted to get the agency right. You sort of show up at the CIA, and after about 2 days, you realize that everything you see in the movies and other books is completely wrong. It's wonderful, and it can be wildly entertaining, but by the second page of most spy thrillers, the protagonist in real life would have been arrested for some kind of gross malfeasance or doing something illegal on American soil. And I thought when I looked at the real business of intelligence work, particularly that of the case officer, there's a ton of human drama and intrigue, and not to mention just the tradecraft, and particularly some of the rituals around surveillance detection that I put in the book. I think all that stuff is really dramatic and interesting, and it's not explored in a lot of spy fiction, and I wanted to bring that to life. I also wanted to do a bit with the CIA, like a Michael Connelly might do with a police procedural or courtroom drama, where you're bringing some of the bureaucracy and the procedure and the policy to life, even the stuff that's kind of not glamorous, but that allows the reader to get drawn into this world because it's sort of based on the authentic organization of the CIA and how it runs itself. So I wanted to get the CIA right. I also wanted to get Syria right. I think a lot of spy fiction, not to necessarily knock it, but it's pretty one-sided. There's sort of good and evil, and there's a superhero protagonist, and the bad guys are sort of diabolical, Russians or Iranians or something like that. And I was not particularly interested in writing that kind of book. I wanted the real Syria to come through. So I've got 3 or 4 characters in the book who are Syrian, and their point of view drives the story forward, and they have agency in the book. And I think the conflict in Syria is so complicated, and there's so many different perspectives on it, that I wanted to show those perspectives and bring that to life. And I wanted to bring, I think, also to do something with the war and the people in the book that sort of express it, that draws some kind of tension between moral clarity, right? So there's good guys and there's bad guys in the story for sure, but there's also a lot of moral ambiguity in the book. Bad guys do good things, good guys do bad things, and I thought, to me, that just felt more like the human experience that I knew and the Syria that I saw during the war. So I wanted to get those kind of 2 big things right. So I sat down to write the thing. It was really fun. It was also really painful to finally get the thing out there. But I'm really happy with the way it turned out, and I hope that as folks open the book, that not only will they be sort of drawn into just a narrative that's fun to read and turn the pages, which ultimately is what I'm going for, but that as you go through it, you kind of get to know the real CIA a little bit better, and get to know what Syria was like and what it felt like, to be in the early years of that war. So, really excited to be in conversation about both.
All right, good. Thanks very much.
Yeah, you bet.
Thanks also for braving I-35 this morning.
Yes, someone had to do it. It was dangerous.
I really appreciate it. If I didn't say it in the top share, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I read it quickly. As soon as it was published, and I enjoyed it. I recommended it, and to lots of folks in different venues. So I think it's just a really good thing. So you covered the first time. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you found your way into intelligence, the CIA. You answered that. Sounds like intelligence found you.
Yeah.
To a certain extent. But the specialization is of interest. I mean, this is a school of public policy, so we've got a number of folks in our student cohort that are exploring jobs in Washington through other agencies, intelligence, analytic work. So this is all of interest to all of us. Now, was that your idea to become a Middle East analyst, or were you just a talented undergrad that they identified, brought you in, and then somebody assigned you to a team and you were a Middle East analyst?
So I'll answer this truthfully, and I don't know if it's a good answer or a bad answer, but I was very young, right? And I had studied abroad, and I had traveled a lot, mostly in Europe. I spoke French, and because NISA came to recruit, I was going to be in NISA, so I literally got a call from one of the recruiters 2 months or something before I showed up, and they said, "You're going to work on Syria." And someone gave some kind of reason around Syria having been part of the French mandate, although no Syrians really, it wasn't no one speaking French in Syria. It was from Lebanon. But that was it. And so I was in the funnel as a Syria analyst.
Off you go. So for the uninitiated, NISA is Near East South Asia, one of the analytic offices at CIA. But don't spend a lot of time memorizing that since they've changed all the names.
Yeah.
Now part of the Middle East Mission Center. So that's great. Now you've spoken. I've heard a few of your other talks in preparing for this, and you've spoken in very flattering terms about how challenging, interesting, and what the daily excitement you had being a CIA analyst. Nonetheless, you left after 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, that's true.
And I'm a little curious, what were some of the factors that led you to believe that this wasn't a career for you at CIA, and you'd like to do something else?
Yeah. Well, so I think I had gotten to a point where I was sort of, and maybe this wasn't really true, but it felt true at the time, that I was worried that if I stayed, that I would just be there forever, and that would be my career. And I was enjoying the work. But I sort of made the half joke about what, Wendy's, like literally the private sector experience I had up to that point in my life was as a cashier at Wendy's and installing sprinkler systems. And so I was in my early 30s and I was thinking, like, I don't know how businesses work. I don't know how they make decisions, and it felt to me like I wanted, and I thought at the time I might leave for a few years and then come back to something that would be more related to national security or intel or something like that. But I was excited to kind of get out and explore a little bit, and I felt like I wanted that learning experience. We also, my wife and I, just kind of wanted to get out of DC for a while, and and coming down to Dallas for a couple of years to take a consulting job that allowed me to get inside a whole bunch of companies and learn how they work was really appealing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was thinking as you were describing that, maybe in your application you referred to that as putting out fires, the irrigation system. So obviously, anybody who's read the book knows you're extremely well informed and on the situation in Syria and the Middle East more generally. You have views, including on policies the U.S. government might have adopted, implemented over the time. Yet we know that runs counter to the core ethos of being an intelligence analyst, which is just the facts, objectivity, neutrality, no policy, preference. Do you have any difficulty, since you have these strong views and you're well-informed views, you know what you're talking about, writing intelligence on a regular basis that was straight down the middle, free of any personal bias or any preference that you might have had when you went home and actually thought about the problem?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is certainly true that every analyst is going to they have policy views on. I mean, you can't look at these countries for 12 hours a day and think, like, I just don't care what we do. So every analyst there is going to have a perspective about what Washington, what the president should be doing about this or that situation. So I think, it's certainly, as you know, like, foolish to pretend otherwise. And so I certainly did have those views as a Syria analyst. Many of which we'll probably talk about here in a few minutes. But I honestly don't think it was hard to separate the work of writing things that were not value-laden, were not sort of judgmental or emotional, but just relayed what's going on, why is it happening, what does it mean for the U.S. I think one of the first things that they sort of feed into you as a new analyst is this job is about telling the truth to whoever is reading this stuff, and it's about being objective and fact-based. And I think that the analytic cadre then and now takes a tremendous amount of pride in that as part of their craft, and instances of even the allegation of writing something that's politicized or something is taken very seriously at low levels of the organization. It matters a lot to us, and so I think it was actually not hard to separate what I was writing from my sort of personal beliefs about what should happen, because it was almost like two different ways. I knew that what I thought would be wise to do, or that President Obama or whatever should have done, had no bearing at all on the kind of objective analysis that I had to write to inform that policy.
And in that sense, it's a bit of a credit to the training.
I think so.
And the culture. And
yeah.
As our friend John Brennan describes it, the ethos of the business.
Yeah.
You didn't come with that. You acquired that.
Yes. Oh, for sure. And I think a lot of the newer analysts sometimes, even before because there can be a period of you show up and it might be 4, 5, 6 months before you can get into what was then called CAP, the Career Analyst Program.
Right. At the Sherman Kent School.
Right, exactly. And I think sometimes the analysts who show up and maybe have 2 or 3 weeks on the job and are starting to write something or helping someone write something, you kind of get they haven't gone through that training yet, and you think about the job a little bit differently, and it has to be educated out of them.
On a similar topic, writing. We spend a lot of time here in graduate policy school working with our students, helping them improve their writing. So this is writing for policy, intelligence writing, and I'm personally a big fan of the director of analysis at CIA, and they're very disciplined, objective writing style, very crisp, very concise, and we try try to convey that to our students. You obviously have great skill and great talent for writing. So my question for you was it easy, or was it a daily frustration to try to write in DA style?
Yeah.
We assess that, we judge that with confidence at this level, that level, or the other level. Or was it a constant struggle for you to suppress what's obviously a natural talent for you, creative and expressive writing?
Yeah. I think it actually was a little bit of a challenge for me. Like I remember sometimes my bosses would trot out what was then called the DI style guide, when pieces were being edited, and I'd be like, oh God, the style guide again. Like I didn't like it, to be honest with you. And it was kind of hard to get that beaten into me. I did try to sneak some creative flourishes into pieces occasionally.
They'll eventually trade that out of you.
They will eventually trade that out of you. I do think that I was successful in getting the word Hobbesian nightmare into a PDB at some point early in Syria. I don't know if the 9 layers of review sort of collectively blacked out and let that through, but it did make it.
This time I'm seeing you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's terrific. You mentioned a little bit earlier, now turning to the story a bit more directly. You mentioned earlier, some of the characters. Sam Joseph, our case officer, protagonist, Miriam Haddad, his agent, and a colorful cast of other characters that I just enjoyed getting to know and hearing about, and watching them perform under stress. Where do these come from? Are these real people? Are these composites of people, or is this out of whole cloth? Because these are some pretty colorful and interesting characters.
Yeah.
Several of whom I think I recognize.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I have to be careful. I'm going to say it's a highly classified state secret who these characters are based off of. The answer is that most of them are composites of people I knew at the agency, so maybe you do recognize some of them. So like Sam, for example, is like I get the question a lot: is Sam me? And he's obviously not in any way. I took 3 case officers with whom I had worked pretty closely, and started to write down stories that I'd heard them tell, the things I knew about them, or just the mannerisms. And over time in the writing process, he kind of became his own character and had his own energy and drive. But it started as this kind of composite. It was the same for the very colorful station chief, Artemis Proctor, who
handy with a shotgun.
Extremely foul-mouthed and is very. I think she's a wonderful character, but it kind of started as a composite of a few female case officers that I knew and went from there. The analysts actually. This is what I probably do need more careful with, because the 2 analysts that are in the book are actually, I've obviously changed the names, but they're basically real people.
Are they still on your team?
Well, I actually got a note from somebody who'd been on my team who was like, you need to cover up the fact that this person is actually this person better, because it's so obvious who they are. But most of the characters, and the same with the Syrians, actually, I sort of, Assad actually is in the book himself, but a lot of the senior Syrian officials are based off of real senior Syrian officials that I had studied when I was at the agency.
Thanks for that. So loyalty and betrayal.
Yeah.
On the book jacket, that's sort of the heart of this. And you already described the relationship between the case officer and his source, Miriam, a Syrian. You did find one of the central tenets of American human doctrine, and that is that there can be no emotional or close and continuing physical relationship with sources, for obvious reasons, because of the conflict of interest that creates in the handling officer. Why did you seize on that? And what do you find that useful for? Because for an operations officer, every hackle on your neck stands straight up. We've seen it happen. It never ends well. It's vigorously investigated and punished, as you reflect in the book.
Yeah.
What drew you to that particular red line?
Yeah. Well, I was really my favorite spy novel, or probably my favorite novel, is John le Carré's Little Drummer Girl, which explores some similar dynamics in the relationship between the Israeli handling officer and his English agent. And I remember reading that I think I read it as a teenager, probably 15 or 16, and I thought that the depths of sort of emotion that you can get to and the energy that you can get to in that relationship was really quite interesting and powerful. And I think as I started writing this book, I was struck at, I'd read Little Drummer Girl before I ever joined the agency or thought about it, but then sort of watching some of these case officer agent relationships at the agency, talking with case officers about it, you realize that even if you put aside the romantic attraction or anything, I mean, it's a very intimate relationship. I mean, you're sort of, they're exposing themselves to you, the case officer, if they're handling it well, is also, reciprocating some of that to build trust in the relationship. There's some undercurrents of manipulation in there too. Obviously, the stakes are incredibly high. And then I felt like if you layer on top of that romantic attraction, the fact that, then the case officer is breaking rules, obviously the agent is spying for a foreign power, you're dealing with a tremendous amount of potential energy that, makes it a lot easier to not only just drive the narrative forward in a novel, but to, really kind of create a lot of tension and intrigue in the inner lives of the characters that you as the reader hopefully want to see worked out through the book. So it just felt like it was this great mix of all this stuff that made it really explosive. And I knew that I wanted there to be, even if it was sort of illicit in some senses, there to be a kind of love at the center of the book, because I wasn't really particularly interested in writing. I mean, the book is dealing with some pretty grim stuff, but I wasn't interested in writing a book that ultimately took a pretty dour perspective on the potential inside human relationships.
You succeeded. It adds a tremendous amount of complexity to the story. Speaking of complex characters, I'm now thinking of Miriam a bit. And correct me if I'm wrong, but as I read this, I sensed that the narrator, that you in this case, had some sort of appreciation, some kind of empathy, or at least understanding for some of the people on the regime side.
Yeah.
And the dilemma they found themselves in. It seems as though some of the characters, even though they're part of the ruling clique of Bashar Assad, were nonetheless trapped, unable to escape, part of a corrupt system they created, but were now unable to get out of. Where's that from? That kind of empathy for the evil side, the people who brought this all along.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so you use the word trapped, and I think that's a good one. I remember listening to and watching and sort of hearing testimony from some of these security guys on the Syrian side in the early months really of conflict. And, many of them came from very sort of humble or even, less than advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. They hadn't really profited much from the regime. They were doing work that in our context you might see as something akin to like police work, right, at the time, and certainly before the crisis. And they were kind of lower class, largely white guys who come from the coast, and they were not advantaged people. And the overwhelming sense you got from hearing the stories and listening to them was that they also felt trapped in the system completely, like they were just stuck. And I think that dynamic was interesting to me because there's definitely a tendency, and look, I mean, I'm not, I think the book hopefully makes it clear that I view the Assad regime as a horrendous force and it's done despicable things to its people, but there are individuals in that system who are deeply ambivalent about it and who felt like they had no alternatives, and whether or not that's true, slightly different thing, but that's how they felt, and that's how they communicated and thought about it in those early months and years of the war. And so I was interested in bringing some of those characters to life, because I don't think that story is frequently told or really maybe even allowed to be told in a lot of the Western coverage of the war, which has tended to either sort of black and white, there's good guys and bad guys, or it's just everything's so complicated and the place is so messed up. We just want to keep it at arm's length. And I think that the dynamic, especially of being in a system or a structure, whether it's a political system or a family, that cuts off a lot of your choice and a lot of your agency, is not something, at least me, but maybe a lot of Americans don't really experience that, like someone in Syria would. And I thought that dynamic to me was similar to adding love into the case officer agent relationship, was one that gives you a lot of ways to deal with the character and what they want, and builds tension over the course of the book.
It is interesting. It succeeds at that in their historic analogies, of course. Even regimes, people with varying gradations of culpability.
Yeah,
for
sure.
Regimes responsible for. Many of them just being dragged along.
Yeah.
Unable to escape, as we said. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but you mentioned John le Carré. I'll ask you, there are a lot of fans of spy fiction in here, a lot of avid readers. Who's your favorite? What did you try to learn from them? You mentioned John le Carré, so we'll grant that. I think he's the master. What did you try to learn from him? And who else is out there that really inspires you? Is worth reading?
Yeah. Well, part of the reason I love le Carré is because I think he's not even really a spy novelist. He's just a wonderful novelist and storyteller. And so, who just happens to write about espionage. And who doesn't really have any care, at least in later books, for the tradecraft or anything like that. And he's driving stories forward with the characters and his storytelling, which I love. I love Charles McCary. I think he made some comment at one point around how he wished that he'd never gotten stuck writing spy fiction, because he just wanted to write stories that are, again, character driven and look at love and, families and this kind of thing. So he really works that into his books, and I really appreciate that. I love the late Jason Matthews. His Red Sparrow trilogy, I think, is wonderful, and I found it. I had never heard of it. I discovered it when I was like almost through the first draft of my book, and I was like, "Damn it, Jason! This is exactly what I want to be doing." I think it's just wonderful, and I really like all of David Ignatius' stuff. I think he does a great job of bringing kind of the real CIA and some of the procedural aspects that I was talking about to life. I read a lot of other stuff that's probably much less connected to reality. I'll read all the Silva books, and I enjoy those kind of beach reads. But for the stuff that I think is really dealing with the actual business of it, it's probably McCary and le Carré and Matthews and Ignatius. Those are the big ones.
Thanks. I appreciate you recognizing our former colleague, Jason Matthews. And I was immediately reminded in your surveillance scenes, these extended surveillance detection routes in advance of operational activity. The opening of Red Sparrow is Moscow Rules, trade trap.
Yeah.
And you and he both do a great job of capturing. SDRs are thrilling and fun, but a tremendous opportunity to fail and betray your agent. So good, thanks for that. And now let's turn to the region and the Civil War itself. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the wind-up. We want to get into some of the details, but could you just sort of map out the arc in Syria from sort of 2010, early 2011, as the Arab Spring arrives? People are in the streets, there's optimism, there's hope, there's been change. In Egypt, and then it's fair to say 11 years later, we're in essentially a frozen conflict involving regional powers, a proxy war underway, so much destruction in the country. Now, partway through there, you left, but I know you continued to follow the topic. You couldn't otherwise. What are the key points for people to understand how this turned from hope to despair and pessimism?
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, it's been there's so much to cover there. I think, when Syria, when we started to get the protests in Tunisia and then Egypt, Syria was at the time, kind of maybe even backing up a little bit from that. When we were writing about it in the DI, we were almost entirely focused on foreign policy topics. To be blunt, it was how does Syria connect to the Arab-Israeli peace process? How does it connect to Lebanon? How does it connect to Iraq? So it was through this lens of it sits in a very strategically important position in the region. There's not a lot of oil. There wasn't a lot of oil. They don't have a nuclear weapon. It's a small country, right? So from a geostrategic standpoint, it just was kind of this. It was like a 1 PDP a year kind of prior to 2011, and maybe 2, but not many. And there were when protests started in Tunisia and Egypt, we kind of a lot of the same kindling was there in Syria, right? There's probably a very long laundry list I could give from the predatory security services, very narrow patronage networks, wage stagnation, droughts and economic and water mismanagement in the east and northeast of the country that had drawn all of these people into this kind of hinterlands around the major cities. Big youth bulge, just like most of the other places in the Middle East, and it was ripe for the same kind of protest. Now, the thing that made that first few months so challenging was that I think in some respects, from a forecasting standpoint, we had gotten to the limits of what you could really predict using the intelligence we have, because what we were actually in the middle of was a mass psychological shift of, 2 months ago, none of this was possible. Now it is. And, things changed inside people's heads rapidly and overnight. And so this kind of wall of fear that the Syrian security services had built up over 40 years fell down pretty quickly. And for the first, to kind of chunk the conflict up into bits, the first year or so, it was very fashionable in a lot of the press to kind of describe the Syrian regime as using very, very, very brutal methods early. And it's not exactly true. So for the first year or so, they primarily deployed their security services to try to quell the protests. That obviously didn't work because you're sort of using the tool to solve things that's actually causing the problem to begin with. And so they couldn't, and frankly, the regime had no political legitimacy, no civic institutions. The state had sort of hollowed, and it only had a repressive apparatus that they used to try to suppress this protest movement that grew from, 1 or 2 kind of small pockets in southern Syria in March of 2011 to by that summer, it was really a nationwide protest movement. And it was largely peaceful, although there were the sort of seedlings of an insurgency happening in the spring of that year too. In part driven by the fact that the regime itself was realizing that it didn't have the tools to combat a kind of a civil opposition movement, and the regime itself sought to militarize the conflict. And so they let Salafi jihadist prisoners out of Sedna prison to sort of form some of the initial armed groups that would fight the regime, which is hard for us to sort of understand, but they felt they had to do that, so they had someone to fight. The networks that I talked about that had sent people into Iraq actually turned on the Syrians, and you had this sort of battle-hardened group of Iraq jihad veterans who began to take up arms against the regime. But you had, for that first year, kind of coexisting the beginnings and growth of this armed movement and the protests. What ended up happening was that as violence, sort of ticked up, by 2012, we really had the beginnings of like a scorched earth sort of counterinsurgency campaign on the part of the Syrians, and not counterinsurgency in the way that we do it, counterinsurgency in the way that the Russians do it in Chechnya, right? So it's just destroying things. And the Iranians and Hezbollah got involved in 2012, but really over the course of the next couple of years, the Syrian regime, I think, was beaten back to controlling maybe 20-25% of the actual country. So they were losing. In 2013, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more. It was clear that we weren't going to get involved. The Russians got involved in 2015, and over the next 4 or 5 years, the Syrian government sort of clawed back a lot of that territory. But it's now, I think your word of it being a frozen conflict is there is still some activity around these lines of control, but there's essentially 4 kind of zones of influence in the country. You still have like sort of ISIS, underground kind of terror capacity in central Syria, and you've got 5 militaries that are actively involved in the war, and so it's a huge mess.
We'll come back and give you an opportunity to forecast to look forward. We also want to get to our questions. So combining our discussion of the ethos of intelligence with events on the ground, let's go back to 2013. And you as an analyst weren't allowed to have a perspective on the U.S. administration's decision not to respond militarily when the Assad regime crossed the president's red line and used chemical munitions against civilian populations. But your characters are not so constrained,
right?
So they betray a view. Looking back on this now with some benefit of some hindsight, how do you assess that dilemma that the White House was in and the decision that was ultimately taken? There are many of us, people smarter, better informed than I am, would regard that as the low point. President Obama's foreign policy record with long-term strategic implications. What's your take on that?
Yeah. Well, I think that just to kind of back up a little bit to even the beginning of the conflict, I think to explain where that actually came from was from the very early days of the unrest, it was pretty clear to me personally, I was talking about my views, that there was a tremendous gap between our stated objectives in Syria and what we were actually willing to put, like the resources we were actually willing to commit to achieve those objectives. I think that gap was driven by an assumption that Assad's demise was inevitable, that Ben Ali had fled, Mubarak was gone, Gaddafi was gone, never mind that we acted as the Air Force, but there was sort of a arc of history bending toward these guys being deposed, and we could kind of, although I do not think that folks in the administration would have described it this way, I think the result of it was that they had this view that we could kind of sit back, we could say things, and then he'll be gone in 6 months or 9 months or whatever, and then we'll figure it out then. Over time, as it became clear that Assad had staying power and that his foreign backers were going to very seriously support him, that gap just kind of widened. And I think by the time you got to, and we kind of started to, realize in 2012, 2013 that the Syrians weren't they were kind of testing this red line. They were poking a little bit to see what could they do and what could they get away with. And that gap kind of persisted. Well, I mean, I think my view on the red line situation, and I think I would also be speaking for a lot of the other analysts who were on my team, was that it was very hard to understand why once we committed to that and we could have done something, why we did not. And the debates around this in retrospect have kind of gotten sucked into this weird dichotomy of either any kind of intervention would have had to have been deposed to Assad or we should have done nothing. And I think that's just not true. We could have easily responded in a punitive way to the use of sarin and other chemical weapons. We, by the way, also could have done that with respect to some of the conventional weapons that have killed far more people in the conflict, like they used barrel bombs. We could have set up some amount of strategic deterrence in those years about the kinds of violence that and it sounds sort of callous to say this, but the kinds of violence that we would have permitted and not permitted in their conduct of the war. I think we could have done that, and we would not have had to go all the way toward removing Assad. And my view is that we should have done more but that it probably would have been unwise to actually try to unseat him, given the very fragmented and complicated and problematic dynamics that we saw on the ground with opposition, and that we just didn't have there was not a partner who would have been able to construct a better political entity that would have been amenable to our interests. So I think on the red line, pretty clear answer, but I always I never like when it gets sucked into these debates or how we would have had to depose off it. No, we could have punished them and sort of fulfilled our presidential word without having to go all the way.
Thanks for sharing that view. Real quickly before I let you, forecast what we could look forward to in your perspective. There was another U.S. policy in play at the time, and that was out of a classic U.S. foreign policy playbook, find some local forces, proxy forces, moderates, if we were looking for at the time, who we could train and equip and deploy so that we would have some people on the ground fighting for our interests at our nation. Some of these were open programs, some of these were less open programs, but they all seem to have failed miserably. What's your take on that? Was that did we fail to execute, find the right people, give them the right weapons, train them, and send them off on the right missions? Or was the premise wrong? Was there never a moderate group of people willing to go to the Capitol and fight that we could help?
Yeah, I think, so my view on sort of our ability to engage with Syrian partners, I think it's helpful to chunk it out into the policy being Syrian politics and the conflict against Assad and the ISIS fight. Because I think when we look at the fight against the Islamic State, we have backed and built up a very credible force in northeastern Syria, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, primarily Kurdish militia, who have been and were extremely effective in working with us in the counter-ISIS fight. But when you look at it through the lens of the potential for regime change in Damascus, my view is that there was never really a group that would have been, I suppose if we had been willing to commit a tremendous amount of national power and resources above what we did, it may have theoretically been possible, but in the scope of what we were sort of willing to do, even at the high end, I think these opposition groups, the ones that at least were not, outwardly solidly jihadist, never had the capacity, the training, the cohesion to really be successful. And very early in the fight, it was, like I said, all those guys with the Iraq jihad credentials, and the pre-existing organizations, really familial ties, military training. They were the ones who were always going to be the most effective on the battlefield, and they were from a very early stage. So I think that was doomed to failure from the start.
Interesting. Thanks for that. Okay, last substantive question. I know Will's jotting notes on his pad, which is a warning. So I heard you
got ideas for his next stop.
Yeah. I heard you talk to my friend Michael Morrell a couple of days ago, and he asked you to forecast. I'll ask you to do the same. I wasn't surprised that a DI analyst would have a pessimistic take on the topic. That's what comes with the territory, right? We expect nothing less. But yours was particularly pessimistic on prospects for a unified Syria anytime in the near future of any variety. Sort of, you were comparing it, as I recall, to the Sri Lankan conflict, sort of decades-long, persistent, unresolved conflict. Is that really how you see Syria, and why? What are the main forces at play here, and how do we end up with essentially a frozen, unresolved, destroyed society?
Yeah. Well, I think we've kind of, the lens that I take on sort of where the lines are right now is that we've probably reached some of the limits of what the regime can actually retake because of what it's become in a lot of respects. I mean, it's more like it's more like a warlord kind of fiefdom or a militia than it is like thinking about it like a government is maybe not the right way to look at what Assad
You're
has
referring to
now.
the central
To Assad, to the
Damascus,
central government,
not-
yeah.
not some of the regional
Yeah. So their ability to sort of project power, potentially retake the Northwest, which is under opposition control, or the Northeast, which is under Kurdish control, or certainly the areas that Turkey occupies, is probably pretty limited. So I do kind of see it as largely frozen. And if I just look at kind of history, you think, well, okay, how do civil wars end? I mean, there's really only two off ramps. There's a political settlement, or one side wins. In the vast majority of civil wars, negotiated settlements don't work. One side wins. The vast majority of civil wars, I think we looked at this when, so we looked at this maybe, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago. So it was during 2012, 2013, something like that. Most civil wars last about 10 years, and they go a lot longer if you have multiple parties on the ground. So check in the Syrian case, and if you have multiple foreign parties that intervene, so check. So I don't think it's, and when you look at just sort of the political prospects for a resolution, they're basically non-existent. The process ongoing in Geneva is sort of kabuki theater, right? It's just, there's nothing that's going to happen, and the military lines are pretty frozen. So, and everyone's pretty tired. Later on to that, the fact that I think everyone kind of has on the ground in Syria has a view of, I haven't won, but I also haven't lost, and I maybe can't lose, depending on how you define the objective. So I think we're in for just a lot of, it's not to say that the situation won't evolve, but I think the prospects for some kind of resolution that returns Syria to the borders it had under one governing entity anytime, in the next even 5 years is probably not realistic. But, like Sri Lankan example is a good one, right? I mean, that's the war went on for 25 plus years, and I think it did end. It ended. And I think the Syrian one probably will too, because the government, Assad regime, views this, and they viewed this early on as a generational project to, recapture what was being lost. And I think if they win in 2035, that's a victory.
Yeah. But the burden, of course, over these decades is on the Syrian.
On the actual people, right?
So last question. I read very closely at the final pages of the book, and I'll bring it to you. Sam and Miriam are still alive and servicing dead drop sites in the best denied area tradition. So does that mean there's a sequel?
So I've outlined a sequel, but I haven't started writing it. So for at least the characters that survived Damascus Station, there might be some future life in another book. But I've spent most of my time writing another book that's in kind of the same universe. So some characters overlap, but it's set in the present day. It's focused on Russia, and it's exploring the question of the next phase of the U.S.-Russia spy war, and maybe a little bit more colloquially, which I've had more fun with. What would it look like if we really tried to stick it to Putin? And so I've been having fun with that. There's also an angle of Putin's a character, kind of like Assad is, and there's an angle around thoroughbred racehorse breeding and dealing too, and commercial operations. So I'm having it's a weird stew, but it's working for me.
You're in a couple of years, we're talking about that.
Yeah, you're wading into some pretty deep water there. It's
Yeah.
not fiction in Russia.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.